My name's Jenny Smith, and I'm the chair of the Cloud Cafe on behalf of Stroud District Green Party, where a small group of organisers bring us all together once a month to discuss different things. Hope you all had a nice summer break and managed to switch off from the world a little bit, but revitalise yourself as we, stumble towards 2024 and what will hopefully be an election year. So today's event, we've got three fantastic speakers, one that you might know, and two fresh faces that we have invited to join us in the Cloud Cafe community. So I will just give a brief overview of what the session is about, and then I will introduce the first speaker. Each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, more or less, and then we will have time for a Q&A at the end of the session as well. While the speakers are doing their presentations, feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat, and we can come to them during the Q&A section. So today's session is around choosing the best for ourselves and our planet. The mainstream political parties are battling over who can create the most economic growth without taking any account of the impact this has on our environment and our climate. Just one example, Labour's housing plan would blow the entire carbon budget. They're not joining up these dots. Everything that we can make and consume depends on the resources and energy provided by the natural world, and continually increasing resource extraction, industrial throughput and waste production is entirely incompatible with ecological sustainability. So, we're going to kick off with a speaker called Charith Gunawardena, who was a local councillor in the London Borough of Enfield until May 2022. In his professional life, extends from the political to the corporate world, and he's a retired director of the Bula UK Limited, which is a high-tech machinery manufacturer for the global food industry. He's a frequent contributor to Sri Lanka's media on its sovereign debt crisis and on the importance of taking mitigating steps to protect itself from abuses of the unjust global economic order. And he's also an engineer, so I'm sure he's going to tell us a lot of interesting things. So thank you so much for joining us, Charith, and you can kick us off.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for that introduction, and it's great to be part of this Cloud Cafe now. So it seems like I've been locked in from what you just said. Actually, I read a brilliant article yesterday by Jason Hickel. I don't know if you've heard of him, who is a professor at the Institute for Environmental Science and Technology at the University of Barcelona. I mean, the article was titled "The Double Objective of Democratic Eco-Socialism." Now, given a double objective in the title for this event, choosing the best for ourselves and our planet, I actually thought it would be great to extract the main points raised in the article, because it really touched what I wanted to say in the first place. So we face a double crisis today, an ecological crisis and a social crisis. The climate change and other pressures are exceeding planetary boundaries to a dangerous extent. At the same time, several billion people are deprived of access to basic goods and services. Now, more than 40% of the human population cannot afford nutritious food. Even the United States, nearly half the population cannot afford healthcare. Here in the UK, 4.3 million children live in poverty, and closer to us, in the European Union, 90 million people face economic insecurity. So generally, deprivation is most extreme in the periphery, where the imperialist dynamics of structural adjustment and unequal exchange continue to perpetuate poverty and underdevelopment. So it's critically important to understand that the dual social ecological crisis is being driven ultimately by the capitalist system of production. The two dimensions are symptoms of the same underlying pathology. So the key defining feature of capitalism that we must confront is that as a condition of its for its very existence, fundamentally it's anti-democratic. Now, production is controlled overwhelmingly by capital, large corporations, major financial firms, and the 1% who own the lion's share of investable assets. Capital wield the power to mobilize our collective labor and our planet's resources for whatever it wants, determining what we produce, under what conditions, and how the surpluses we generate shall be used and distributed. So for capital, the primary purpose of production is not to meet specific human needs or to achieve social progress. Neither is it they are to achieve any concrete ecological goals. The overwhelming objective of capital is to maximize and accumulate profit. Now, this dynamic occurs within national economies, but also has clear imperialist dimensions. Land, labor, and productive capacities across the global south are roped into supplying global commodity chains dominated by northern firms, instead of producing food, housing, healthcare, education, and industrial goods to meet national needs. Capital accumulation in the core depends on draining labor and resources from the periphery. Capitalism produces too much, yes, but also not enough of the right stuff. Access to essential goods and services is limited by commodification. And because capital seeks to cheapen labor at every opportunity, particularly in the periphery, the consumption of the working classes is constrained. It would not take much as a share of total global productive capacity to ensure decent lives for everyone on the planet. We must also face a second challenge: to achieve well-being for all, while at the same time reducing aggregate use of energy and materials to enable sufficiently rapid decarbonization and to bring the world economy back within planetary boundaries. Technological innovation and efficiency improvements are crucial to this, but high-income countries also need to scale down less necessary forms of production in order to reduce excess energy and material use. So it is clear what needs to be done. We must achieve democratic control over finance and production and organize it around the double goal of well-being and ecology. This requires that we distinguish between socially necessary production that clearly needs to increase for social progress, and the destructive and less necessary forms of production that urgently need to be scaled down. This is a revolutionary world historic objective that faces our generation. Now, Professor Jason Hickel suggests several key objectives. He says to secure the social foundation, first, we must expand and decommodify universal public services. It means healthcare and education, but also housing, public transport, energy, water, internet, childcare, recreational facilities, and nutritious food for all. We must mobilize our productive forces to ensure everyone has access to goods and services necessary for well-being. Second, we must establish ambitious public works programs to build renewable energy capacity, insulate homes, produce and install efficient appliances, restore ecosystems, and innovate socially necessary and ecologically efficient technologies. We cannot wait around for capital to decide they are worth doing. Third, we must introduce a public job guarantee, empowering people to participate in these vital collective projects, doing meaningful, socially necessary work with workplace democracy and living wages. The job guarantee must be financed by the currency issuer, but should be democratically governed at the appropriate level of locality. Now consider the power of this approach. It allows us to achieve ecologically necessary objectives, but it also abolishes unemployment. It abolishes economic insecurity, and it ensures good lives for all, regardless of fluctuations in aggregate output, thus delinking well-being from growth. So next we secure and improve the socially and ecologically necessary sectors. We also need to scale down socially less necessary forms of production. We also need to reduce aggregate production in other destructive industries in a fair and just way. For example, fossil fuels, certain automobiles, private jets, mansions, industrial meat, fast fashion, advertising, weapons, and so on, while extending lifespans and banning planned obsolescence, but also grounded in material reality of ecology and imperatives of decolonial justice. So we urgently need to cut excess purchasing power of the rich using wealth taxes and minimum income ratios. It is irrational and unjust to continue diverting our energy and resources to support an over-consuming elite in the middle of an ecological emergency. The international dimensions of this transition must be front and center. Excess energy and material use must decline in the global north to achieve ecological objectives. For the global south, it requires ending structural adjustment programs, cancelling external sovereign debts, ensuring universal availability of necessary technologies, and enabling governments to use progressive industrial and fiscal policy to improve economic sovereignty. In the absence of effective multilateral action, Southern governments can and should take unilateral or collective steps towards sovereign development and should be supported towards achieving this end. So the ideas outlined above are really affordable. Anything we can actually do in terms of productive capacity, we can pay for. By establishing democratic control over finance and production, we simply shift the use of this capacity away from wasteful production and elite accumulation for achieving social and ecological objectives. Now, to overcome these challenges, it is urgent and important for the Green Party to build alliances with unions, the labor movements, and other working class political formations that have much more political leverage. We need to provide answers to questions of working class livelihoods, social policy, and imperialist dynamics. We must foreground the social policies, organizing to abolish the economic insecurity that leads working class communities and many unions to fear the negative ramifications that radical ecological action may otherwise have on their livelihoods. I'm currently involved in a campaign seeking debt justice for Sri Lanka. I see how our unjust global financial system enables and protects the global and local elites, keep emerging nations in a debt trap that is harmful to its people and environment. So therefore, the Green Party must unite with, support, and defend radical and anti-colonial social movements in the global south. We must foreground Southern workers and political movements as leading agents for revolutionary change. The Green Party must drive this change. Now, I will share the link to Professor Jason Hickel's article in the chat box. It is really worth a read and really expands a lot more on what I've just said. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charith, for kicking us off and yeah, taking us through those really important points. I think so much of what you said was really a big part of this degrowth, sustainable development conversation that we're having here. I think what you were saying around shifting to a focus on well-being and making sure that we're providing services to a really basic standard for everybody in the world is something that is incredibly important, that we're all maybe acting more locally but thinking more globally as we are part of this huge global network. And the emphasis that you're putting on the global south and the struggles that there are in the global south in terms of being able to have sustainable development, even though they're constantly trapped in a cycle of debt and other things that really need to be addressed and eradicated if we're going to be making sure that the movement is inclusive of everybody, which I think Greens really want. And what you're saying also about creating a narrative or creating a story that connects with the working class, again, is something that is really important for the Green movement to get right. So thank you very much for kicking us off, and I will move us on to our second speaker. Also, if you could share the article to the Jason Hickel article, that would be fantastic. And I'm sure some questions will come up for you as we move on. So thank you very much. So Molly Scott Cato, I'm sure none of you have heard of Molly, so I'll give you a brief introduction to who she might be. So she's a professor of green economics and has published widely on topics relating to green economics and creating a just and sustainable economy. She's the Green Party spokesperson on economy and finance, and she also has the experience of trying to explain the need to respect planetary boundaries in a media environment where economic growth has become a fetish. Molly, your 10 minutes starts now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jenny. It was great to start with Charith. One reason is whenever I do my spiel, which is quite UK focused, people always say, what about the global south? So it's very nice to have addressed that at the beginning, actually. And the other thing I note is interesting that Charith puts that focus on job creation and job guarantees, because I think that might conflict slightly with what Mark's going to say and the whole role of UBI. So that will become an interesting discussion later on. Anyway, my time is going to be spent just imagining myself as Chancellor, which I do obviously regularly, and just thinking about how we might manage the economy in a way that didn't centralize the idea of it getting bigger all the time, essentially, which is what happens when you have an economy focused on growth and GDP growth. So we're going to get really sick of this as Greens over the next year and leading up to the election. The debate is all going to be about growth. It's all going to be the Labour Party and the Conservative Party arguing with each other about who is going to be more successful in creating some growth, which actually neither of them seem to be able to create at the moment. There's not going to be any consideration there about what that growth means, what's actually being created, and we've seen some really interesting revisions of the growth figures recently, and people are sort of really starting to question whether this is a good way to measure the economy. We look around ourselves and we see everywhere we've got infrastructure in chaos, public services that just aren't working anymore, and businesses exploiting their workers. And both those two main parties are going to argue that the solution to these problems is growth. But actually, growth is just an indicator of activity happening in the economy. It doesn't tell you anything about what that activity achieves, or indeed the damage that it might do. Neither of those main parties are going to recognize that when they keep focusing on that growth, actually, the economy is already up against the planetary boundary, and the fact that we're in a climate and ecological emergency is a clear sign of that. Actually, this measure of growth, GDP, dates back to the war. And at that time, it was like, let's just make as much stuff as we can. Basically, weapons. It was a way of focusing all the resources of a country on making more and more weapons to survive in a war. So maybe in a wartime economy, if you end up in that dreadful situation, there's some logic to that, but unfortunately it's spilled over into the peacetime economy, and we still have this sort of manic attempt to always get more and more economic activity, and it's now being very destructive to our well-being as well as to our planet. It's quite hard to argue the case for living within planetary limits rather than chasing after economic growth, and that's because if you make that case with just everyday people, it's totally obvious to them that you can't carry on growing the economy forever within a limited planet. But unfortunately, to economists, it's just as obvious that that's exactly what you have to do. And if you don't do that, you're going to end up in some appalling catastrophe. I mean, as somebody who trained as an economist, but has sort of been a rebellious heterodox economist all my life, I can tell you this is an area where economic orthodoxy is really in charge and is totally contrary to common sense, and has caused that contradiction is causing us a lot of problems. So just to give a few examples of what's wrong with the growth measure and why it's just not a logical way of deciding whether your economy is successful or not. Let's imagine a parent who goes out to work instead of looking after their own child. That's brilliant in terms of economic growth because you get to boost it twice, once for the work the parent's doing and once for the work that the person looking after that child in a nursery is doing. If they decide not to go to work, then the economy shrinks by both those amounts. But that doesn't actually tell you anything about whether the child's happier being looked after its parent or in a nursery, or indeed whether the parent's happier being with the child or being out at work. Another example is environmental disasters. I mean, obviously they're coming at us thick and fast at the moment, aren't they? And they count as a positive for GDP. So do weekend leisure flights to Amsterdam. So do people doing more online gambling, even if that ends up with them, committing suicide, becoming bankrupt, whatever. All those things boost GDP. But conversely, the lovely afternoons and the lovely times I spend on Friday with my grandson, they don't feature in GDP at all, although they do enable my son to get on with his work. Nor do the clothes swap parties that you might enjoy going to, or the vegetables you grow on your allotment. It's a great time of year to remember that. I've had a fantastic pumpkin, just finished cooking the last bit of it today. So in spite of rather rocky times with growth just recently, we have levels of wealth measured by GDP that our parents could only dream of, but we also have record rates of mental illness. 70.9 million prescriptions for antidepressants were given out in 2018 compared with just 36 million, so they doubled in a decade. Far from this economic growth adding to our well-being, actually the treadmill of production and consumption is undermining our well-being and just basically driving us crazy, as well as destroying the planet. So this is the point where I've got a note to say, make sure I say that there's lots of people in the world that haven't reached a decent standard of living yet. And when we talk about degrowth, we're very much talking about the over-consuming economies of the West. But I don't need to say that because Charis made that point. So just a little point about distribution. When we talk about GDP, gross domestic product, sometimes that's talked about as gross domestic product per capita, GDP per capita, per person. But that's just a ratio. You just take the GDP, the economic output from a country, and you divide it by the number of people in the country. That's somehow supposed to imply that actually all the gains in the economy are shared equally, when we all know that they're not. So it's a very misleading statistic, I would say. We could actually double the size of the economy, but all the increasing value went to the top 1%, the richest 1% of people in society. And that would definitely make us a worse society rather than a better one. In fact, that's pretty close to what has happened in recent years. There was some research done by the Brookings Institution, and they calculated how much of the share of the increase in the size of the economy went to the richest 2% between 2010 and 2020. And they found out that in the USA, it was 65%. In Germany, it was 51%. And in the UK, it was 33%. We might think about why it's lower in the UK. But anyway, you can see most in the US and Germany anyway, most of that increase in growth has gone to just the top 2%. And even in the UK, a third of it has gone to the top 2%. So this growth we're talking about is not benefiting us all. It's actually trashing the planet, and a very small number of people are benefiting. So, of course, this brings us to a really important question, why do we carry on judging the success of our economy in this way, according to this very flawed measure? Well, I've been listening to Diane Coyle recently, who's a Cambridge-based economist who's quite focused on economic growth in her research. And she said that there's likely to be a change soon. And this is quite encouraging after just 3 decades of us campaigning for this. It does seem that the official economists are starting to, that they are actually carrying out a reappraisal of the GDP measure, and they are looking like they might make some changes. But what they're going to do is address things like unpaid care. So they're going to now put a monetary value on me looking after Oren, which I actually don't like the sound of very much. And they're going to deduct value for the loss of environments. So that will be some improvement, but it's still basically working around GDP, which is a very flawed measure to start with. In some other countries, they have what they call satellite accounts, which means they still focus on GDP, but then they do say how many trees they've got and, you know, how much, how well they're doing in health terms and so on. So again, that's my question. Sorry. So do we have a fully worked through alternative? Not really. But my view is there could be a way of doing this now. We could have very complex, we have very complex input output tables, like we know for all the different kind of sectors of the economy, how much they're producing, how much is going in and coming out in economic terms. And I think what we should move towards is defining those sectors in terms of whether they're contributing to the sustainable society we want to build or not. And I think you could actually get that down to a single number that would be much more powerful and useful than GDP. So just to conclude, if you imagine yourself as the Chancellor of the UK, you would want to know how much economic value was being created in monetary terms, and you would want to know how much tax that was going to yield, because you would need to know how much you would have to invest in public services and other investments. But this is not a good way of measuring the value of the economy as a whole. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly. As always, wonderful to have you on as a speaker. And yeah, I think that GDP has always been sort of a magic number that they pull from the sky for many people. But I think that when you break it down to the fact that even when we have growth, it's not growth that is per capita, it's growth that is, you know, directed to the top 1 or 2% of the country, which I think a lot of people would understand and agree in a more meaningful way that that's not valuable if they knew. Okay, we've already had a question in, but I'm going to save it for when we have the Q&A. Just a reminder that anybody can pop a question in the chat and we will pose it to our speakers at the end of the session during the Q&A. But thank you so much for taking us through that, Molly. Okay, so our next speaker is Mark. Mark is a reader in the Department of Economics at the University of Sheffield. His research investigates the links between the labour market, health and disability, and well-being, which seems absolutely on point for this conversation. As well as carrying out academic research, he's worked at projects for government and private sector and is an expert on statistical techniques to assess the impacts of policy changes on the economy. He's interested in the economic rationale for the UBI, Universal Basic Income, both now and in a possible future society, and in particular how UBI might interact with the labour market. He co-authored the UBI Lab Sheffield proposal for a UBI pilot. So welcome, Mark, and thanks for joining us, and hopefully you can share your slides.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just sharing the screen. And hopefully just making it bigger. So hopefully that is full screen.
Yep.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. This is actually not my main job. This is not a day job. This is kind of something I do on the side. I got into this because I do teach policy evaluation. So that's why I got into this, doing a proposal to do a pilot in Sheffield where we try and evaluate the effect of a UBI. And we did the proposal, but like most of these proposals, of course, it's enormously expensive to fund. So it hasn't been actually happened yet. but who knows, maybe one day. Sorry, I'm hiding behind slides and the title isn't very inspirational. I guess I'm wearing half a UBI hat and half a kind of semi-mainstream economist hat tonight. So I'm kind of looking at this from two angles. I'm sort of injecting a bit of skepticism into this, maybe. But so I was told maybe some people didn't know what a UBI was. So this is the official definition of one, according to the Basic Income Earth Network. So it's a regular payment in cash to all individuals. So it's not targeted on any group, and it's unconditional. So there's no requirement to be employed, for example. What you'll notice here is it doesn't actually say how much it is, and nor does it say how it will be funded. And in my experience, those are the two questions that people ask when you talk about UBI to them. So just to give you some sort of background before I go on to details, these are the kind of amounts that are generally proposed within the UBI community in the UK. So we're talking about figures of between 50 and somewhere slightly higher than £200 a week. I'm always going to talk in terms of weekly amounts because that's, I think, sort of probably the easiest thing to relate to. The higher amounts of those would replace most benefits. So say if we had a UBI of 150 or more, it would probably most benefits would either be replaced or people would just float off them because of the means testing. And of course that would help pay for some of this. Otherwise, for the remaining bit, then the main source of funding is almost certainly going to be taxation, and that's what I'll talk about tonight. So really, I just kind of want to make some simple points, I think. The first one is about the importance of framing this. And I think this is important in terms of the political messaging about how you present it to people. It's also important because it kind of tells you what an appropriate level for the UBI might be and possibly how it will be funded. And I would say the dominant framing, the dominant narrative around this currently is around replacing our dysfunctional welfare state and fixing that and ensuring that everybody's got enough to cover their basic needs. So that's the kind of framing that starts from the amount that we think it should probably be and then goes on to think about the funding after that. The other type of framing that I want to talk about is where we think of it almost as a dividend that flows from the way the economy operates or the way the economy could operate. So it's a rethinking of the structure of the economy. And in particular, it's thinking of the common resources that we all have in common and the idea that we're all owed a share of that. Now, just to preview kind of the conclusions of this, the first one is a large UBI and the second one ends up being a small UBI. And I'm kind of going to come out in favor of the small one, and I'll sort of explain why. But in doing that, I'm also going to try and sort of inject some realism about the basic magnitudes here. I think in the UBI community that I'm familiar with, sometimes there's a lack of appreciation of just how large the amounts of money are that we're talking about here. So I think it's important to stress that, and I might be probably labouring that a bit too much, but anyway, we'll see. Then I just want to ask: is UBI really green? So this actually comes on to the issues of job guarantee, I think, and the role that a UBI would play. Would it actually be a green policy? I don't think that's necessarily at all clear. And then finally, I want to go on to just sort of summarise the benefits that I think could flow from a sort of dividend style, quite modest UBI. So there's lots of figures in this presentation. I think they're all credible. I don't think I'm misleading anybody. They're all referenced, and I don't know if you circulate the slides afterwards, but there are links in there, so to all the references. So just looking at the first sort of way to frame UBI, then the basic needs UBI. The idea here is that you want to think about what an acceptable level of UBI should be. And one way to do that is to, for example, look at the minimum income standards. And these are developed at Loughborough University, where they they do focus groups and take samples of the general public, and they ask people what they think are the minimum levels of money that you would require in different aspects of your life. And so obviously the results are very detailed and complicated, but once you boil it down, you end up with a UBI of something above £200 a week for an adult. The other way you can do this type of thing is, say, thinking about GDP and per head, you can sort of say, well, what percentage of GDP per head do we think a UBI should be? Or you can think about disposable income per head, what sort of proportion of that should a UBI be? And you kind of end up with figures that are somewhat lower than the MIS level, but I would argue certainly the top one is kind of in the same ballpark as those. If you do the calculation of what that will cost, then you end up with figures sort of around a gross cost of between about 400 and 650 billion. Some of that would be paid for by benefit savings, so maybe 150 billion, but that still is going to leave you with at least 250 billion to cover out of probably taxation. And just to sort of emphasize, or the scale of the challenge here, a point of comparison is that to fix social care, it will cost 15 billion. And we all know how difficult that has proven to be. So, you know, the social care levy, it was 1.25% added onto national insurance, and it only lasted a few months. So I'm just trying to emphasize really the challenge here. If you look at what sort of taxation you would need to fund that sort of level of UBI, then Howard Reed and co-authors did this study this year, which very helpfully costed some of these higher levels. And what you can see is it would require if you did it just with income taxes, you're talking about basic rate income tax of 48% or 65% for that £200, £230 a week level. Now, we should stress here that this is kind of affordable. As Charith was saying, if you have the resources to do it, it's affordable. So this is just a transfer. So this is potentially affordable. But I think the question is it acceptable? And this comes to the issue of connecting with the working class. I think people are very resistant to very high income taxes on what they perceive as they're just rewards that they've earned. There's an issue with doing it just with income tax, which is that it's basically the employed paying for the non-employed, because it's the employed that essentially contribute the bulk of income tax. So even though most households under these schemes are winners, so they get more UBI than they pay in taxes, within households you can get winners and losers. There's a lot of households where the full-time earner will be a loser and the part-time earner or the person who's non-employed will be a winner. So I think that's another issue which can be problematic. The solution to that is to spread it over other sorts of taxes, of course, but I would argue that's kind of just displacing the problem in a way. The question always comes up, can the rich pay? And there's some figures here from a project they did at the LSE and the University of Warwick, where they looked at the sorts of revenues you could potentially get from taxes on wealth and high earners. And you can see here that these are just not going to be able to pay for a large UBI, a sort of an acceptable basic needs style type UBIs. They're just not big enough. So it can't just be the rich that pay. It is going to be ordinary taxpayers who pay for a lot of it. Similarly with corporation tax, even if you put that up by 10 percentage points, it would just be 27 billion. So the question that then comes to me about this is, how do we actually, assuming you think that these are credible numbers, which I would argue they are, how do you deal with this? Do you say, as some people do, well, it's just about political will? That's one possible reaction. Another reaction, which you don't tend to hear very much, I think is a totally valid reaction, is basically, well, what this proves is that the system can't deliver. The system is not capable of delivering an income which will cover the basic needs of its population. So, we're demanding what it can't give. We want to transcend the system and build something better. So I think that's one possible reaction that you can have to those figures. So that's the sort of first type of UBI. The second different framing is to conceptualize it as a share of common resources. So here we're thinking of the types of revenue that could emerge from economic activity, in particular if we could charge for use of the commons. So the commons is, well, I'm sure everybody kind of knows this, that the commons is mineral resources, land, clean air, data, maybe the night sky with all these satellites going up and apparently starting to pollute the night sky. And this is kind of conceived as an additional income stream. So it wouldn't be sort of seen as something to replace benefits. It would be just an additional source of income alongside that. And Guy Standing's done a lot of work on the commons, as I'm sure people know, mentioned there at the bottom of the slide. He's got this book, Plunder of the Commons, which goes into this in great detail. But what I've done here is just taken a very simple example, and I've used the Policy Engine tax benefit simulator, which is online. So there's a link there. And I've done a little example of if we had a carbon tax of admittedly quite a high level, £100 a tonne, and we had a land value tax, and we supplemented that with a tax where we raised national insurance on higher earners to the same level as lower earners. If we did that, we could raise £108 billion, and that would fund a dividend of £35 a week for adults and £15 a week for children. Now, you might think that sounds very low. How can that have an effect? I'm going to argue in a couple of slides that would have, I think, a significant effect. Guy Standing, though, he has a more sophisticated scheme in his book where he brings in a sovereign wealth fund and a few tax reliefs, and he gets it up to £70 a week after a couple of years. Just want to ask the question, is a UBI green? So we all hope it is. We all hope it's going to promote these environmentally friendly behaviours. But from a macroeconomic perspective, I don't think this is at all clear. The modelling I've seen, I'm not a great expert on this, but certainly those two attempts at modelling the impact of a UBI conclude that it would boost the economy because it's like a Keynesian stimulus. It boosts consumption, it boosts employment. So it's the kind of the opposite of degrowth here. So I think this is a risky strategy, a risk associated with UBI, and so maybe this sort of links into the issue of whether it would be better to have a job guarantee, which we can probably talk about. But my view certainly is that as a standalone policy, it won't necessarily be environmentally friendly. It needs to be coupled with other things. One thing I think it would go nicely with is a 4-day week. So on this final slide, I'm just sort of outlining some of the benefits I think could come from a relatively modest dividend style UBI. The first thing is in terms of framing. I think it's actually easier to persuade people to support a UBI if you present it as a share of the common resources that we're all entitled to, rather than sort of presenting it as a redistributed mechanism using taxes. It's worth noting, I think, also that what I call sort of actually existing UBI schemes, they're all based on common dividends. So the best known one is the Alaska one, which uses probably maybe not a good example, but oil to fund an annual dividend of between $1,000 and $2,000 to everybody that lives in Alaska. There's the one with a band of Cherokee Indians where they have a right to use to operate casinos on their land, and they share the profits from that to everybody. And I think that's a few $1,000s a year as well. But all of these, the ones I actually know of that exist, are sort of common resource ones, not taxation-based ones. If you have a small UBI as opposed to a big one, it gives you a much wider choice of taxes in the sense that you can pick and choose the best ones. Whereas with a big UBI, you end up having to increase everything or all the major taxes to fund it. The level I did in that example, £35 a week, it might not seem very much for a lot of people, but I think for people on low income, it would be a significant amount. If you remember back to COVID, we had the £20 a week universal credit uplift, and that did seem to have a significant effect. And that was per household. This will be per individual. And in Policy Engine, you can do simulations that actually show the effects on each decile group in the income distribution and the wealth distribution. and predict the new poverty rate, etc. So that little dividend UBI would actually cut poverty by 32% according to that. And again, there's a link in there to that. Finally, as I said, I think could be coupled with a 4-day week. And if you take the loss of earnings that a minimum wage worker would experience if they went from 5 to 4 days, this seems very small, but it's actually only £57 a week because of all the taxes and national insurance. And it's only 26 if they're on universal credit, because they'd get more universal credit if they drop down to 4 days. So a £60 dividend would more than compensate them for going to a 4-day week. So I think that will go very nicely with a 4-day week policy. Obviously, people higher up wouldn't be compensated if they're going to just take a proportionate hit to their earnings. But I think, I think they should be reducing their consumption. So for me, that's not an issue. So that's basically what I had to say. Supporting the idea of small is beautiful in terms of UBI.
Thanks so much, Mark. I think there will be a lot of food for debate there. So very interesting take. I mean, some of the things that you was talking about, like the need to address the dysfunctional welfare state that we have and reimagining the economy that we work in at the minute. And I think the question that you raised around, is this a green policy? For me, what Greens want is a whole system change. There's not like one answer to the question that we how do we make a better society for everybody. UBI is part of a whole system change with regards to like rent control, mortgage control, renationalize public services, decreasing the cost of living so that something like a UBI would actually be way more valuable to somebody because they wouldn't have so many costs going out all the time. Also, looking at things about like fossil fuel subsidies, all those things that we don't want to keep happening. What kind of cost is that on the UK economy, and how can we include that in some of these things? I mean, also like the mention of job guarantee, like I would love to never have a job again. I would love to not work. I don't see that as a negative thing. I see that would be able for me to be able to put my energy into things that I actually care about and actually want to do. And it wouldn't mean that I wouldn't work ever again, but it would mean that I wouldn't ever have to be paid for work again, which I think is a beautiful thing. And likewise, the cultivation of culture and arts and all those things, and even just like being a stay-at-home mom or being a stay-at-home dad, and the opportunity that it would give for people to step out of what they're forced to do into something that they want to do, which I think would be a beautiful thing. But very interesting. Also very interesting, you mentioned the 4-day work week, which for the European Greens, that I think the UK Greens have signed up to, the 4-day work week is not a reduction in pay, it's the same amount of pay. But all very interesting things. I'm going to be quiet now. I'm sure there's some questions in the chat. Okay, so first of all, Werner's iPad. Would you like to ask a question to our panel? Are you still here?
Yeah.
Oh,
I am
fantastic.
here. Can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks.
Okay. So I think my question was, much of the world is moving in the opposite direction from the model outlined by Hickel, fueled by the emergence and now the dominance of neoliberal economics. The why and the what are clear. It is the how that is the huge challenge. What will need to happen to initiate a reversal?
Okay, fantastic. Speakers just jumping. Charith, okay, I've seen you've unmuted, so you can go first and then we'll go to Molly. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Werner. I think the starting point, again, if you're talking about really re-looking at making a systemic changes, we have to start by saying the whole purpose of the economy is to support the well-being of people and the planet. So you have to start by those two objectives. And we really need to, and generally what happens with all the current conversations is we are trying to force all these different single ideas into the existing economic structures and economic programs. So if you take something like the well-being of people, there has to be a common consensus of what we want a fellow human being to have as a basic minimum. And if we cannot specify that, I know it's not an easy one. Many people have different requirements. But I mean, if you even take the 80-20 type of rule, there'll be a lot of the basic things which should be able to agree on. You need housing, basic decent housing, right? Food, education, healthcare, social care, affordable energy. I mean, there are certain things which we all need to have, right? And without being able to define that, all the rest of the conversations I don't believe are really valuable. So, and this is particularly the case when we talk about people who go for work. So there are people now who are going and doing a full day's work, working to their best of their ability, and they can't meet a basic standard of living. I mean, I was a counsellor in Enfield. The average, median household income is £34,000, and the median house price is £400,000, 11 to 12 times, right? So before we can even talk about the economic situation, we must be able to say and come to a common consensus, say that anyone who goes to work, particularly if they go to work, you must be able to have a basic living standard, and we have to be able to define that. And then the economic system has to deliver that, right? And that's where I struggle with the idea of the UBI is to deliver these basic needs, food, education, health, various things. You have to actively provide those goods and services, right? So you can't randomly expect it to just happen, nor can you leave it for the private sector, who are profit-making private sector, to deliver those services in an affordable way. So it has to be a managed process. And what I would say is we really need to be able to come to a common consensus about what that basic minimum is, right? Now, that's not an easy thing to do, but I'm saying without that, all the other discussions sort of are meaningless to me.
Thanks, Jared.
Could
Molly?
I just ask Werner what he means by going in the opposite direction?
Well, I guess my question was more about, so what's going to be the trigger point for making change? So we can see that the climate's moving in the wrong direction. We can see the increased global climate catastrophes. And we can see that in recent years, there's been a massive growth in inequality. And yet, we don't see what the trigger point for change is. Interestingly, today I saw some research that says that the Greens would poll 19% if we had PR, which was a very interesting piece of data. But I guess I'm surprised that the Labour Party is heading in the same direction. It's neoliberal economics going exactly the same direction as the Tories. So what's going to be? Is it going to be mass protests? Is it going to be war? Is it going to be climate catastrophe that actually initiates the change?
Look, I don't do crystal ball gazing, but I am clear that our policies would make a big change. And I also saw that statistic, and I think it's quite humbling, but really interesting that 1 in 5 people in this country think we should be running the country. I mean, I think we should all just take that on board and reflect on it and take ourselves a lot more seriously than we sometimes do, because we're proposing some really radical stuff. And 1 in 5 people are like, yep, I trust the Greens. I don't know how much they know of what we're proposing, but look, I'm a big believer in tax. I think tax, I don't particularly believe in tax because I'm rubbing my hands with glee about what you can spend the money on. I believe in tax because it can change the way the economy works and the way people work. So I'm very annoyed that Mark got in with the suggestion of the carbon tax before I did, because I'd love to say that. And I bribed our leadership. I said I'd give anybody who said carbon tax on radio or TV a bottle of wine. And it actually worked really well. So they said it quite often afterwards. But so that, we're talking about the climate crisis. Actually, I think we left it really late, but now I think the action is quite fast, and I'm quite surprised by how fast things are shifting now. You know, sustainable finance agenda, investment in transitional, you know, whether it's energy or vehicles or so on. What's not happening is the social change that we need to see. Like, so we're getting electric vehicles rather than buses, but we are seeing, I think, politicians, even neoliberal politicians that like capitalism, realizing, you know, the whole system's screwed unless we act on that. So it's too late, but there is action happening fairly fast. It's not so easy to change the whole way your economy works. You know, it is a transition. It can't happen overnight. And also, I mean, you're totally right. I pointed out that we are trashing the planet to make a very small number of people a lot richer, but there's nothing inevitable about that. Tax could really address that. I think you also mentioned Richard Murphy's work. I'm not signed up to everything he's saying, but we've got a paper that I've written that one of our leaders is going to launch fairly soon, which is called Here's the Money, Rachel, because basically everything she's saying she can't afford to pay for could easily be afforded by taxing rich people more. So just making sure that they pay as much on their investments as they do on their earnings. Also stopping the fact that once you earn over 42,000, you actually pay a lower rate of national insurance, which is just completely bizarre. Plus actually an asset tax, a wealth tax that takes people's assets away from them. And actually it's quite hard to do that in a way that doesn't allow people to continue to grow richer, because once you're that rich, you accumulate wealth so rapidly. So, you know, rich people are getting richer. Yeah, let's take that money away from them. You know, even Jesus thought that was a good idea. And it is very popular. I can't answer, well, I kind of understand why Labour are going where they're going, because they're afraid of a speculative attack by financial markets, and they've pocketed a lot of money from corporate interests these days. But our policies are out there and they would address a lot of these issues. And obviously there's not just Green parties in the UK. As Jenny knows, there's Green parties right across the world offering a similar kind of platform. So if you believe in democracy, that's our job, isn't it? To go and tell people this is on offer and persuade them they should be voting for it. And we've already got 1 in 5 people, which is not bad.
Great question, Verna. And thanks, Molly and Charles. And Mark, just unmute yourself and come in if you'd like to answer anything or make any points.
Yeah, I mean, just on the direction of travel, I tend to agree we are going in the wrong direction. I suspect we're going to carry on going in that direction until we have a real catastrophe. I think it's going to get a lot worse before, hopefully, it starts getting better after that. But I'm a bit, pessimistic about that. Just on the 4-day week, I'm not totally convinced by a 4-day week with no loss of pay, because if there's no loss of pay, then what changes? I mean, consumption's not going to change. You've got an extra day to spend it in. So I mean, economically, for me, it's difficult to see how productivity would be maintained in 4 days. I mean, I know you can do it in some jobs. I know there've been pilots, but to me, it seems a bit heroic to think that we can all have the same pay for doing a day less work. But anyway, that's just me.
I'm going to agree with Mark on that, because I'm going to disagree with a lot of what he says, given half a chance. But on this one, I mean, as an economist, you just look at what's going in and what's coming out. And it's fine, if you sit in an office job, you can come in a bit earlier and, do a bit of stuff at the weekend maybe. But, that's not the case if you work at a car factory. So, yeah, I think it's a little bit woolly and white collar, but that is the proposal. And I mean, you could probably have said the same when people, worked 12 hours a day in mills in the 19th century. Probably economists said the same thing Mark and I are saying now. So maybe economists are just not ambitious enough. I don't know. But
I mean, you could bring it in over a period of years, and you could take the productivity gains as time rather than money. So you could sort of keep your current level of earnings, and it just wouldn't grow or grow very quickly. I think that's probably the way to do it. So on basic needs as well, because I'm advocating a smallish UBI, that doesn't mean I don't think basic needs are important. I do. So, but to me, that will be separate. So I do think the welfare state needs reforming, big reforms, but I'd keep that separate.
This takes us back to a really important point Jenny made, which is it depends how much money you need, depends how much you have to buy, right? At the moment, about half of what people are earning is going on rent. And but that's just because we're living in a rentier economy now. People are just getting that money for doing nothing. If people had council housing, or even if housing was taken out of a market altogether and you just had a right to housing which was provided free of charge, you could live on half the income you've got now. And I think, like you said, Jenny, one of the things we're trying to change about the way the economy works is a lot less of it is in a private market, and a lot more of it is provided either through the public sector or through community and so on. So yeah, the sort of cash aspect of your life would shrink, but that doesn't mean that your well-being would shrink.
Amazing. Okay, thank you guys. All right, I'm going to move us on to the next question, which is from Gary Luff. Gary, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, it's a relatively simple question, but in the costing of the UBI, did it take into account that the extra income might be taxed for people who already have relatively high incomes?
Sorry, you mean the UBI?
Yeah.
So that's in the tax to pay for it, yes. So if you're in the top 20% of households, then you are going to be paying more tax than you get back in UBI.
Yeah. Sorry, it's a slightly different point from that. Say if you are in that top 20, let's say you get an earnings of £50,000 a year, and you get £200 a week from UBI, so that's another 10,000. Would you pay tax on that 10,000?
Not in most models. Not in most models, no.
Okay.
If you tax it, then it will be cheaper. Because
actually, in our model, you lose the tax-free allowance, and that substitutes for UBI for most people. So then when you go to work, you face a very high marginal tax rate at that point. But that's part of the point, because we don't want to encourage people to go to work. We want to make sure they've got their basic needs met. And then if they do go to work, they'll pay a much higher rate of tax.
Yes, I mean, most of these models, almost all the UK models where they use income tax, they get rid of the tax allowance either totally or almost totally.
So did you net those off in your models? Did you net off the cost of the tax-free allowance?
Well, in the one that I quoted, the big UBI that Howard Reed did, the tax allowance goes down to 750 from 12,500. Right. In the example I did, the little dividend, that wasn't financed using income tax, so no, the tax allowance stayed in that one. But yeah, you can. There are two views on this. You can tax the UBI if you want to reduce the cost disproportionately for higher earners, or you can just leave it as untaxed. I think I'd tax the UBI, but then I wouldn't have it going into means testing for a dividend. So it'd just be it would be like the universal credit thing. If everybody would just go up by 35. But then I might tax it so that, people who are earning will get less.
And can I just add one other point on people spending and whether spending would go down if people worked less? Well, there are two reasons why it probably does. One, you have to pay to go to work, whether that's driving there or whatever. And the second, quite a lot of spending in advanced economies is positional goods. And so maybe that would change. I don't know, but I would imagine it would do.
Are you suggesting we'd all sit around in our peasant clothes because we wouldn't have to sit at our desks anymore? Because I'm really for that.
Yeah, possibly, but there's two parts about it as well. People tend to spend more when they feel insecure, and so the more secure they felt, the less need they would possibly have to spend money to make themselves feel less insecure. I don't know how big an impact that is, but it might be one.
Yeah, and happiness definitely feeds the economy, because we all buy things that we don't need that we think are going to make us feel better. Okay, very interesting. Thanks, Gary. On to the next question, because we've got quite a few and I can see more popping up. Hugh Barton, would you like to ask your question? If you want to unmute and ask. If not, I can ask it on your behalf.
Mute and start video.
Oh, we can hear you. Yeah, great.
Start video. Doesn't seem to want to do that. Okay. Well, it's Hugh Barton, and I want to go back to where Charith started off, which was about the GDP measure. Start that video. unable to start video. Okay.
We've got video and we can hear you. So
You could. Oh, okay. I mean, the basic problem is the attempt to reduce everything to money, and it goes right through our society. And thus, I'm a bit suspicious that maybe economists aren't the right people to answer economic questions, because they immediately think in terms of cash and money and income, and actually we need to think in other terms. So my question is really, what about chucking out GDP and cost-benefit analysis and other measures which rely and tend to determine this decision-making present, and replacing it with some measures of quality of life and quality of environment, something that relates to sustainable development, encompassing social, economic, and environmental issues. And there have been many attempts of this in the 90s and the noughties by local authorities in particular, which have tried to sort of assess what's the well-being of people and the well-being of the environment. So should we just chuck out all these economic measures and look for something completely different? Not to exclude the economy, but see it as part of it.
Let's just imagine, Hugh, that you did that with your household budget now. And I'm not one of these people that says a national budget is like a household budget, but let's just imagine that you said, or I said, because I've resigned from my job, so I'm living on a very small income now. Let's imagine I said, oh, I'm going to forget about how much money there is in my bank account. I'm just going to, do whatever it is to make myself happy. I tell you what, I would run into debt very quickly, wouldn't I? So there is a way in which how much value you've got in your economy actually matters. Let's think about what happened with Liz Truss. She said, oh, well, I'm not going to worry about actually how much money's out there. I'm just going to do these fantastic tax cuts to all my mates who put me here. Immediately, there's an attack on the British economy. We're all paying more for our mortgages because of that. So when you're actually managing an economy, the amount of money there is available matters. Now, Charith can explain to us how we have the power to create sovereign money and so on. And so we don't have to be bound by the sort of fiscal rules that Labour's setting itself so that it won't be able to invest properly in hospitals and stuff. But there are limits, and you do have to know what's available. So in that sense, I would defend measuring the economy, and GDP does measure the economy. What's wrong is that we start from that and then we allow that to govern everything else that happens in society. That's the mistake we make, in my view. So, I mean, I'm also not a huge fan of economists, and I think giving economists this sort of sole power to decide policy is really misguided. But I'll tell you where economists really score, and that is in being able to understand a system. And that's quite bizarre, isn't it? Because actually a lot of them don't take ecology into account, and that's also a systemic way of thinking. But so people often say, why do economists always say yes and no at the same time? The answer is because anything that happens in the economy will feed through into all the other things that are happening in the economy. So you can't say this is good or this is bad. It's good and bad all the time. And that ability to see the whole system and how anything that happens that is what the economist has to do. And actually, even if they've got some presumptions wrong, they usually are quite good at that. And if you didn't have that, you'd end up with the Liz Truss situation, and that wouldn't be good. I hope I've made some sort of defense for economics.
I knew I'd get you going. But
Sorry.
I'm not trying to deny the value of the economic models, but I'm saying the ecological models and the public health models and the other things which relate to the overall value that people put in their lives and the quality of their lives should be equally balanced with that, rather than seeing it as something sort of on the side. Well, the cost of clearing up pollution is a valuable thing because we're spending money on it. There's a sort of we get, and I've been thinking what you were saying. You were almost coming to that, because you were saying, yes, we've got to look at the ecological models as well.
No, I agree with you about that. Of course, I agree with you about that. But I just think you can't just say we don't care how big the economy is or what. We do need to know that stuff, because we need to know if we can build another hospital and a million other things.
Yeah. Common sense.
Thanks. I think Charith wants to come in on this point as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I think just to expand on what Molly was saying, I also agree with Hugh in terms of we have to do these measurements in a different way. The current way the economic system has been designed is not designed in a way to maximize the well-being of people and the environment. So once you are in that situation, you just cannot get it right. We are just trying to talk certain things, and you're just going round and round in this circle. So we cannot talk in this framing of the current way the current economic system is designed. Now, we rarely talk about the fiat currency. So when you had the global financial crash in 2008 or the COVID problem, the central bank issued hundreds of billions of pounds, right? The United States in 2020 printed $6 trillion just like that. Now, when the United States prints money, because they are the global reserve currency, they can purchase any item anywhere in the world. And if you take countries like the global south, why we are in such a desperate state is they have printed the money, given it all into, not to the multilateral institutions like the World Bank or IMF, they have given it to the private equities, hedge funds, wealth, big private wealth people. Now those people are lending money to countries and nations. Now, that's why I get sort of frustrated with even the way we talk about it, because the Green Party needs a lot of investment to do these really, really radical investments in renewable energies and do this huge transformation. We cannot talk about those within the framing of the neoliberal system. And unfortunately, we are falling into that trap. And not really challenging those arguments. So I would almost say that we should start by saying we can spend for socially and environmentally important things, right? Because a sovereign government can afford those items. When the argument comes that if you spend uncontrollably, there will be inflation, then we can always talk about, yes, there are tools to remove this excess inflationary currency from the economy, and that tool is called taxation. Now, if you talk about it in the wrong way around, when we say we need rich people's money to do socially and environmentally important projects, it completely messes the discussion out. And we should radically change that concept by saying the government can spend on important projects, socially and environmental projects. If there's inflation, we will go after the money, excess money, and the people who are holding that excess money to control inflation, not the other way around. And I think we need to try and do those type of change the narrative if we are really trying to make a systemic change to what we really need to achieve.
I think the question there, though, is who do you tax when you need to take out this excess money? Who do you tax, and why is that an easier problem than taxing them in the first place?
Because the ones at that stage, you're not talking about taxing people to pay for the poor or doing redistribution. You're just saying we have achieved the issues by providing the basic housing, foods, all those services and public services. If there's excess money because you have pumped so much money into the economy, it will be held in the hands of a very few people, right? And you just take that out through taxation. But it's not for social or environmental programs. It's purely to control inflation. And you just select your programs. It could be private jets and mansion taxes and whatever it is, because those are the ones which are causing the inflation. People are holding huge amounts of land and enjoying that through rentier economies. You go after that. But the basic social and environmental needs would have been delivered in the meantime, because the government has the means to spend on socially and environmentally important things.
I've just dropped a link in the chat where I did argue. I didn't go quite as far as that. I sort of stretched it as far as I thought the current media chat would allow, which is saying, you know, essentially the Chancellor was arguing, we've got inflation, so we can't afford to pay public sector workers more, and we can't afford to raise benefits. But he wasn't challenging the consumption of wealthy people, which of course is just as likely, well, probably less likely to contribute to inflation, but it still will. Anyway, I made that case in a press release I've dropped in there, and actually somebody at The Guardian liked that because they did share that in the live feed. And then somebody came on the radio the next day, sort of saying, why doesn't anybody argue this? And as usual, I'm sort of banging my head on the table, but I agree with what Charith's saying, but it's quite hard to make that case when economic orthodoxy is such a long way from that.
I think my issue would be, why is it the rich that are causing the inflation? Why isn't it everybody?
No, it
you
is.
know,
Even if it's
so-
everybody, poor people can't afford to consume less because they're already not eating, right? So therefore,
Right,
take the
but-
money out of the part of the economy where
But-
people can spare it. That's the argument.
But that's just doing the thing that's just recasting it in the form we had before, where we tax the rich to pay for the poor to start with. Isn't
No,
it?
it's not
that-
actually. It's if you
It's doing
accept that
things-
inflation is too much spending in the economy, let's make sure that the people who are spending what they don't need to be spending are the people that stop spending, not the people whose children don't have enough to eat now. That's the argument, but that's still within the existing paradigm. I agree, but it's sort of hopefully moving a little bit towards what Charith is saying. But if I'd said what Charith had said, nobody would have picked it up. That's the problem we've got from a comms point of view.
Love this speaker on speaker conversation that's going on as well, guys. So very welcome, very welcome. Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next question, which I believe is from Martin Brown. Martin?
Yeah, hello all. Well, it's a naive sort of question and an old one. If growth is essential to capitalism, and we, as I think we mostly here do, think growth is unsustainable for all the reasons we know, and yet we want production of what we see as human necessities, how are we going to do it? We have, what's the alternative to capitalism? And I am aware that since 19th century revolutionaries, people have been trying to solve this one. And you know, things like more progressive taxation, better welfare provision, UBI may make capitalism less vicious, may be better for people, but they won't in themselves end capitalism and therefore won't end growth. And so we're stuck with what I think was the original problem of the discussion here. Anyone got
Thanks,
an alternative
Martin.
model?
I was actually reading about donut economics today, so I love
Shall
that.
I come in there? Because
yeah,
I mean, I argue in my book, as people always say, that green economics is indeed an alternative model, because it basically takes a different approach to the three main factors of production within any economy: money, land, resources, and labor. So capitalism, I think the money system is a big problem, because if you always expect everything to increase by 3%, then that is an automatic driver of growth. So one proposal would be to take a lot of the finance system out of that private profit-driven system. Anyway, when I say 3%, obviously money is just created completely at whim. I mean, the restraint of the capital balances is really tiny now. So that is a big problem, and that is why getting a grip on the way money is created and the way it circulates through the economy is absolutely crucial. And that's why we support monetary reform and public banking system and not allowing private banks. Actually, at the moment, our policy is 100% reserve ratio, which would stop growth in its tracks. I don't think we'll have that by the time we get to the election, because that would cause mammoth recession, and that's not what we want. But so that's dealing with money, right? Then why have we got then basically, if as an ordinary person you then borrow money, say to buy a house, you have to work then to provide the income to pay back the bank that you borrowed the money for the house from. And so that's an impulse for you to work more and more. So that's why people are working more and more and demanding all this work, even if it's pointless work, selling people things they don't want to buy, or you know, encouraging people to do online gambling or whatever it is. It doesn't matter, because you've got to find that work to drive to find the money to pay off the money that you borrowed. And so that's why changing finance would help with that. You know, if you had a house provided by the local authority for a low rent, you wouldn't then need to be constantly working more. So you wouldn't be looking for more work. You wouldn't be contributing to driving the economy. UBI would help because then you would have your basic needs met. So you could choose how many additional hours you worked. Again, you wouldn't be on that treadmill and looking to work more and more. So that would deal with the labour part of the equation. And then the resources part of the equation. Obviously, we don't think that people have a right to just live from the value of land, whether that's the Crown estate belonging to the King, or, you know, somebody whose great 19 times great ancestor came over with William the Conqueror and has lived off that land ever since, and so on. So we would have a land reform and a land taxation. So land was owned differently, so, and everybody benefited from it, but also you would have to take that part of the growth driver out of the economy as well, by changing the way land was taxed and owned. So I think that is an alternative economic model. It's not a Marxist model, because it doesn't say, you know, overthrow people that currently owe the means of production. But over time, I think it ceases to be capitalism if you made those changes. Now, it's a little bit like Blue Peter Guide to Playing the Flute, what I'm saying, because everybody would respond to what I'm suggesting, right? It will be a dynamic situation, and the biggest and first response will come from the financial markets. So this is why when John McDonnell proposed a few of the things I'm suggesting now in 2017, you know, he was casting a wary eye at financial markets, but Labour didn't get close enough to government for the speculative attack to come. But that would be the main problem with what I'm proposing, because capitalism is there and it's very powerful. And any countries that try to do anything like the sorts of things I'm suggesting, that's where the attack comes from. So that's the bit I would worry about. But actually, how you would do it in theory, I do think we have an alternative model.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks, Martin. Either of our other speakers have any comments? Okay, fantastic. We've got one more question in the chat I will go to, and then I will ask each of our speakers to give sort of a 1-minute summary. What do you want people to take home from this conversation that we've had tonight? So just be thinking about that while we come to the final question. So, Rob, your final question in the chat.
Oh, hello. I just wasn't sure why the Labour Party policy on housing was seen as unsustainable. I mean, I don't know it in detail, but I thought it was actually one of their better policies. I mean, we're meant to need, but well, experts say about 3 million, but I think the Green Party's got down for 1.5 million houses. How do we provide sustainable housing? And what is it that Labour's not sustainable about?
Thanks, Rob. Molly?
The Labour's house building programme would produce so much CO2 that it would already bust their budget that they've proposed elsewhere for CO2. That's the problem they've got. And that's why our proposal is retrofit and reuse of existing homes rather than building new homes. Building new homes is an incredibly energy intensive business. Just think of the energy embodied in the bricks and so on. So Josh Ryan Collins at UCL has done that work and shown that 3 million homes, new homes built would exceed the carbon budget Labour set themselves.
Is it possible then to, I haven't seen that, could you put a link to that?
Yeah, I'll see if I can find it.
If you can find it. Yeah, I haven't seen that.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, any more comments on that? If not, I will move on to our sort of final summaries from our three speakers. Just to say thank you everybody for your questions and for the debate tonight. It's been a very interesting Cloud Cafe. So to our three speakers, if you could give some people something to take away from this evening. What do you want them to think about? What do you want them to tell other people about? If we start with Charith, if that's all right. Sorry to call on you first, Charith.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm not sure if we answered the original question. Choosing between our well-being and the environment, how to deliver those two things. So the main message I would like to people to take away from that is to say that we have to make sure that the economy is there to serve the well-being of people and the environment, and not the other way around. And to do that, we have to first define what we mean by the well-being of people and the environment. And it cannot be just about people in this country, because when we talk about climate emergency, it's a global issue. And there's no point the UK doing things within a particular budget when there are 8 billion people and going up to 10 billion by 2080, right? So we really need to also think about what do we want our fellow human beings outside this country, particularly in the global south, to have a minimum as a way of life. And for that to happen, if it's a means of sharing technologies, which we have, right, and not competing and trying to get them to buy unaffordable goods and services from us, then we will be also contributing to the improvement of the climate crisis, addressing the climate crisis. So today, because it's capital that's controlling everything, you cannot have a meaningful dialogue with anyone out in the global south, because it's the people with the money who are pulling all the strings. And so the main message, particularly from the Green Party side, is that we have to try to at least paint a picture of what we mean by well-being of people and the environment across the world. And then we can try to put some numbers behind that afterwards.
Thanks so much, Charith, and thank you for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your time. Mark, if you'd like to go next.
You're on mute, Mark.
Thanks. Yeah, lots of things have come up in the discussion, which obviously I'm not, hadn't necessarily occurred to me before in terms of the overall context. So I think that's interesting. It's interesting to think how a UBI would fit in with those other things. And I agree that is a really crucial thing to consider. So I guess I would say just kind of think about a UBI and how it would mesh with these other sorts of policies, but bear in mind these magnitudes that I've been going on about tonight and just how large they are. If you go onto the policy engine, if you go on or just search a policy engine, and you'll see you'll get to the website, you can do simulations of different combinations of UBI and taxes. So they've got this UBI center area of the website, and it's got the carbon tax and land value tax, and you can separately adjust the income taxes and stuff. So I would just play around with that and look at the sorts of levels of taxation you need to finance different levels of UBI, and look at the distributions, and look at how well off people are in the lower deciles. And you'll see just how difficult it is to have a generous UBI that's only paid for by the higher deciles. So that's what I would say. Interesting discussion about MMT and money creation. I'd like to have more discussion about that. So obviously I was talking about the UBI being funded by taxes, but as Charith said, it could potentially be funded by printing money. But as I've said, I think you just end up with the same problem after the event, because you have to raise tax to take out the extra. So to me, it's more or less the same thing.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Thanks for bringing your perspective and for taking the time to join us this evening. We really appreciate it. Okay, finally, Molly.
Thanks, Jenny. My thanks to Mark and Charith as well for being here with us. It's really appreciated. So I like being in the Cloud Cafe because I know people already have a radical vision of a very different kind of world that we'd like to live in. And I think it's very powerful when you live in a way that says, actually, I'll take less money, but a better life. Thank you. And that's obviously something loads of people living in Stroud have done. And that's kind of why we live here. But when you live in an economy, when you live in a capitalist economy, the pressure is on you to work more, consume more. That's the treadmill that keeps the whole thing going. So stepping off that is actually a very powerful thing to do in itself. And So I'm proud to live here, and I'm glad that we all kind of try and create this vision of a better life. And I think we always need to remember that it's not just about substituting another product that's going to be sold in the market. It's about thinking about moving parts of the economy out of the market and social innovation, so that, you know, we don't need to buy something. So I mean, we all know what that means in terms of recycling our clothes and playing a musical instrument rather than buying a record, and you know, traveling by bus rather than or cycling rather than buying an electric vehicle. So I think that modeling of a different way of living and a different way of seeking well-being is really important. And I don't think we pull our punches very much when we talk about that in public. And 1 in 5 people would vote for us if they thought we'd win in that election. So I think that's a pretty positive note to end on.
Yes, definitely. Okay, everybody, as we've just discussed, you know, happiness is not good for the economy. So get happy and keep having these radical visions and radical discussions. And if you want more of them, then get yourself to the Green Party conference in Brighton, 6th till the 8th of October. We would really love to see all of you there.
It's going to be brilliant. It's going to be focused on the general election. It's going to be really upbeat, isn't it, Jenny? We're going to have hundreds of councillors on the stage all singing along. We are the champions. Yeah, it's going to be fantastic.
Absolutely. It's all about us getting that 20% to 50% of people voting for us. But yeah, please join us. There's still tickets left. The early bird has just been extended, so you can still get a good discount on your ticket. And Brighton is a beautiful place, even in October. So hopefully we'll see you there. And thanks everyone. If you've got the capacity, please donate to Stroud Greens. A lot of work goes into organising these Cloud Cafe events, and we really appreciate it. Thanks, and always shout out to Elizabeth for doing the absolute mammoth part of the work, and to everyone else who pulls in their contacts. And like I said, we'll never let you go. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in October, hopefully.
Thank you very much,
everybody.
Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Thanks.
Cheers.